you very much. It's a real privilege to be here all the way from the Netherlands. So I live in Zwolle, pretty far in the north. So it took me some hours to arrive here, but it's nice to have this symposium on such an important topic. By the way, I was born and raised pretty close to the border of Belgium in Zeeuws-Vlaanderen in Terneuzen. So that could have been much easier. What is the impact of the Reformation on ethics? I will approach this question from a specific perspective, namely virtue ethics. I will argue that the Protestant tradition is not opposed to virtue ethics, but rather a valuable exemplification of it. So that's my thesis. In the past decades, Protestant theologians have shown growing interest in an ethics of virtue. Yet they often presuppose that their virtue ethical approach is somehow contrary to or a correction of the Protestant tradition. So it's not in line with, but opposed to somehow. Whereas theological virtue ethics is seen as completely at home in the Roman Catholic tradition, Protestant ethics is considered an ethics of divine law and human obligations and responsibilities, or perhaps even human rights. Famous philosopher in the United States, Walterstorff, emphasized even the rights discourse in the tradition. In this view, if virtue ethics could be developed along Protestant theological lines, a profound revision of core concepts would be needed. Even more is a criticism that the Reformation has been a major factor in the final abandonment of virtue ethics, paving the way towards a modern deontological ethics and consequentialism as its counterpart. In this view, the characteristically Protestant account of the Ten Commandments as the ordering of the moral life furthered an emphasis on moral principles, rules, and obligations. Alistair MacIntyre, for instance, famously argued that the Reformation inaugurated a process that led to what he calls, quote, the breakdown of the teleological conception of life. So not theological, but teleological, telos. I think Guido van Heeswijk, Professor Guido van Heeswijk already talked about it. A conception, this teleological conception of life, a conception that formed the underlying framework of virtue ethics and its conception of the good life in both antiquity and Christianity. In this view, the Reformation inaugurated a decline of virtue ethics. The reformers broke with the view that human nature has access to the good and can habituate virtues. They devaluated pagan ancient virtue ethics and overemphasized divine grace. Unfortunately, various Protestant theologians, such as dialectical and neo-Calvinist theologians, contributed to this narrative in their criticism of the concept of virtue for its selfish claim, its meritorious scope, and its focus on human perfection. So they criticized virtue ethics. I will not develop counter-arguments against all these criticisms, but rather highlight two things. First, I will show that post-Reformation theology of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century has not abandoned virtue ethics at all. Instead, it formed one of the crucial elements of Protestant ethics. Secondly, I will argue that the Protestant theological tradition has particular contributions to offer for a viable contemporary virtue ethics. So focus on these two aspects. The first aspect, more historical investigation. Although the theology of the Reformation is significantly distinct from and even opposed to late medieval Aristotelianism, this theology still reveals the basic characteristics of virtue ethics. What are these characteristics? First, it includes somehow an understanding of the good in terms of the good life. So, broad understanding of the good. Second, the virtues are seen as necessary for living the good life. And third, human nature as created and also as in need of redemption in the Christian view, somehow is seen as a source of moral knowledge. So human nature is seen as a source of moral knowledge. My thesis is that there was much more continuity of the Christian medieval teleologically structured view of life, natural law, virtues, and the good in Protestant views than is suggested in the dominant views that I sketched very briefly. New historical theological research demonstrates that Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, for instance, played a significant role in Protestant theology, and that Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, as the source book of virtue ethics par excellence, still offered a crucial ethical framework in post-Reformation, Reformed, and also Lutheran scholastic theology. Of course, this does not mean that no changes took place in the understanding of the good and the virtues, in particular in the understanding of law and grace. We could also add the relationship between the several causes, causa efficiens, causa finalis, etc. So there were changes, of course. But this does not mean, yet the Reformers and especially post-Reformation theologians of Reformed and Lutheran orthodoxy or scholasticism identify these two terms as identical, developed their ethics in relative continuity with the multifaceted tradition of medieval virtue ethics, either in an Aristotelian shape, or in a Scotist account, or in a more Augustinian way. So the tradition of Reformed Orthodox theology has been explored extensively, but until now, scholarly attention has been paid almost exclusively to doctrine. Famous scholars in the United States and elsewhere. They are mainly about doctrine. Ethics in the era of Protestant Orthodoxy is an almost completely untraveled terrain. And happily, I have a PhD student now who focus and go into depth in this field of research. I will give a brief introduction to this field, ordered from three kinds of writings on ethics that can be traced in Protestant works during this era. First, there are commentaries on Aristotle's Ethica Nicomacheia, Protestant commentaries. Second, there are philosophical writings on ethics, written by theologians. And third, ethics is treated as part of larger dogmatic works. So first, Aristotle's Ethica Nicomacheia continued to function as the main ethical textbooks in the curricula of Lutheran and Reformed academies and universities. Although the Aristotelian framework of sciences gradually came to be contested in the modern era, as we have heard, this did not affect the status of the Aristotelian ethics in both Catholic and Lutheran, as well as Reformed universities and academies of the 16th and 17th centuries. Following the classical division of the artes into physics, logics, and ethics, courses in these fields followed an Aristotelian model, including the widespread practice of commenting on Aristotelian texts. Notably, no fewer than 46 Lutheran and Reformed commentaries on the Nicomachean ethics appeared between 1529 and 1682. That is, every 3 or 4 a year, a commentary in 150 years. The exposition of Aristotle's ethics continued to form the backbone of moral education, at least in the artist program. This widely spread practice of reading and commenting on Aristotle's ethics is contrary to the impression one gets from the position we find in the early views of the reformers, Luther in particular, which may explain the influential view that Protestantism doesn't have much virtue ethics. As soon as Luther started to lead the Reformation, he advised to discard Aristotle's ethics completely, because, quote, it flatly opposes divine grace and all Christian virtues, end of grace. End of quote. Luther's abolishment of Aristotle and the complete revision of the curriculum that he proposed is often taken as something that actually took place, but this was not the case. Although the Ethica Nicomacheae disappeared from the curriculum for several years in Wittenberg, Luther's colleague and successor, Philip Melanchthon, who had the task of teaching ethics in Wittenberg, started to lecture again on Aristotle's ethics. Melanchthon acknowledged the gap between the theology of Christ and Aristotelianism, but based on the distinction between Gesetz und Evangelium, law and gospel, it was possible to see philosophy, including ethics, as part of the divine law that is about civil morality. Melanchthon lectured at least 8 times on Aristotle's ethics, resulting in his commentary In primum, secundum, tertium et quintum ethicorum commentari. So he did not finish it because Aristotle's ethics consists of 10 books. This work, republished in numerous editions, had unparalleled influence, and since the use of Aristotle was properly based on the distinction between law and gospel, Luther could not have anything against it. Theologians in Lutheran and Reformed universities and academies followed Melanchthon in treating ethics as a philosophical discipline, based on a reading of Aristotle's ethics and very often resulting in a published commentary. To give but one example, Peter Martyr Vermigli, former Augustinian monk and trained as an Aristotelian at the University of Padua, who became an important Reformed theologian, delivered extensive lectures on the Nicomachean ethics at the Academy of Strasbourg. His detailed commentary on Aristotle's ethics was posthumously published in 1563. Vermigli acknowledges, on the one hand, the human being's natural ability to understand the good, and on the other hand, that this ability is divine gift. Natural knowledge needs to be corrected from revelation. Grace relates to nature as restoration to creation. Much more to say, of course, about such a commentary. It consists of 300, 400 pages, so he's very consistently in his exegetical approach. We come to a second type of ethical works. Along with commentaries on Aristotle's ethics, Protestant theologians developed their own philosophical ethics, or ethics of philosophical ethics. Lambert Dano, working as lecturer of theology and assisting Theodore Beza at the Geneva Academy, published the first independent Reformed ethics titled Ethices Christianae in 1577. His ethics was part of a larger project in which he wanted to found all philosophical disciplines on scripture. In Book 1 of his ethics, he offers an anthropological basis with clear influence of Aristotle's ethics, albeit primarily based on the Word of God. In Book 2, he treats the precepts of human moral action based on the Decalogue. And in Book 3, he deals with the virtues and vices that correspond to the precepts of the Decalogue. Dano shares with his contemporaries the view that after the fall, we still are able to discern between good and evil and to understand certain moral precepts. Yet our natural understanding needs to be reformed, and we have the term. Therefore, the Decalogue, which is identical with natural law, is the final norm for moral action. However, this is not at all in contrast with virtue ethics. The final part of his works is fully devoted to the virtues. A third category of Protestant works in ethics can be found in those authors who treat ethics within major dogmatic works, most often as a second part following the dogmatic first part of the book. In this approach, ethics is explicitly treated as a theological discipline. A good example of such a comprehensive work is by the German theologian Amandus Paulanus, end of the 16th century, who published his Syntagma Theologiae Christianae in 1609. Paulanus treats ethics, including moral virtue, not from the perspective of the natural human being, but as pertaining to the regenerate believer. So here is a different emphasis. It's more on regenerate believer. Same holds for Calvin, by the way. It's another story. Approaching ethics as a theological discipline within major dogmatic works was especially common in the era of high reform scholasticism of the 17th century. Another example is William Ames's Medulla Theologiae, Franeker, 1627. Ames treats ethics as the second part after having dealt with faith. In line with Aquinas, he understands conscience, or syntheresis, as the natural disposition of the human mind by which it apprehends the general principles of natural law. Ames distinguishes between the apprehension of natural morality as a universal human intellectual trait and the actual application of that knowledge towards the evaluation of specific actions. In particular, the application of the moral principles is corrupted by the effects of sin on our practical reasoning. Hence, Ames regularly points to clarity of biblical moral instruction. That movement can often be discerned in these works. Ames construes a system of virtues ordered from the two tables of the Decalogue and summarized by Christ in the double love commandment. The language of command, obligation, and obedience is harmoniously related to that of virtue, disposition, and even perfection. As in the tradition, Ames defines virtue as, quote, a condition or habit by which the will is inclined to do well, and distinguishes various degrees of habituation and ways towards perfection, although perfection is given as a gift in an eschatological sense. So my brief investigation indicates that the ethics of Reformed scholasticism developed in great continuity with medieval scholasticism, its morality of the good and the virtues making the good life possible. At the same time, the emphasis on biblical revelation as the main source and criterion is distinctive in these Protestant accounts. Now the question is, what specific contributions Protestant ethics can offer to a viable contemporary virtue ethics? Several relevant aspects could be explored here. For instance, the impact of what Charles Taylor calls the affirmation of ordinary life on the perception of virtue, and the role of virtuous exemplars. I've developed research in that area as well. Or the specific connection between virtue and law, which may be a bridge between pre-modern ethics and modern deontological ethics. However, I limit myself to one challenging theme, the issue of exemplary virtuous people showing moral flaws, or more generally, that most people, most of us, I think, often show mixed character traits, both virtues and vices. In the life of exemplary persons, great virtues regularly appear to exist alongside deep-seated vices. Think, for instance, of Martin Luther King, who was exemplary in his commitment to justice, forgiveness of his enemies, prudence in his work for social justice, and courage to the point of martyrdom. Yet he saw himself and was seen by others as a person whose character was flawed in important ways. This concerns not some incidental acts, but patterns of activities that should be regarded as vices, such as repeated extramarital intercourse and mistreatment of women, also of his, including his wife, which apparently coexisted with his exemplary virtues. This case of what the Catholic philosopher Jean Porter calls the flawed saint seems to be in contradiction with the classical thesis of the unity of the virtues, and the four cardinal virtues of temperance, courage, prudence, and justice, which holds that anyone who possesses one of the cardinal virtues in the full sense necessarily possesses all of them. In Porter's analysis, it becomes clear that neither classical virtue ethics nor Aquinas' understanding of the unity thesis can fully meet this problem. In my view, Augustine offers a more convincing alternative from the radical understanding of the nature of sin and grace, which is followed in the Protestant virtue ethical accounts, as far as I can see. According to Augustine, the problem of the unity thesis is that it makes conversion from vice to virtue implausibly difficult. If we have either all the virtues or none, the consequence is that one must acquire all the virtues at once. In contrast, Augustine defends that it is possible to grow into virtue and to proceed gradually from vice to virtue. A person can have a virtue and a vice at the same time. The moral life of the Christian is understood as the progressive development of love, which is the one entity that underlies the activity of all the virtues and which no one can possess fully and perfectly in this life. The virtue of love, quote, is greater in some, less in others, and not at all in still others. But it is not so perfect in anyone that it cannot be increased in him as long as he lives. But as long as it can be increased, then of course that which is less than it ought to be come from a vice. And typically Augustinian way of reasoning. From this Augustinian view, it is possible to explain the phenomenon of the flawed saint, in whom love is more present than in most of us, but is still not perfect. In some respect, it may even be almost absent, as the example of King exemplifies, but it is still possible to grow until God completes it in the life to come. Protestant scholastics understand gradual habituation and the persistence of moral flaws in a similar way. To give but one example, William Ames, I mentioned him, affirms the thesis of the unity of the virtues, and he speaks in terms of the cardinal virtues. At the same time, he acknowledges that a particular virtue may be stronger in one person than in another, either because of apter natural disposition or more frequent use, or more perfect judgment or of reason, or finally because of the greater gift of life. So he gives several options in how it can develop in people concretely. Ames adopts an Augustinian view in which we can grow in virtue while at the same time being flawed in serious ways. I come to a conclusion. The Augustinian Protestant account may have a liberating, merciful effect, whereas the virtue ethical ideal can have an unmerciful side due to the constant pressure that you have to be as virtuous as possible, while it is in practice impossible to be so perfect. Neither classical nor Thomistic and neo-Aristotelian virtue ethics, read McIntyre, can deal well with shortcomings in the virtuous person, In a Protestant view, it can be acknowledged that the moral life of most people exhibits virtues alongside moral flaws or even deep-seated vices, without the pursuit of a virtuous life being abandoned. This does not discourage us in that we are completely abandoned to our own failures. Rather, we are lifted up time and again by divine grace in continuous renewal. That would be my understanding of reform. Continuous renewal. Grace puts us in the wide space of divine goodness that is present for us despite our failures and flaws. In this way, the radical nature of divine grace of the Reformation that we celebrate today, in a sense, can play a promising role in viable contemporary virtue ethics. Thank you for your attention.
Yes. Hello, I'm very happy to be here and coming from Paderborn in Germany, making this conference even more international. I have to confess, when talking about the impact of the Reformation on interreligious dialogue, I talk about a side effect of Reformation. So somehow it's the dark side of the Reformation, the dark side of Luther. So two things are very important. First, when talking about those side effects, I still acknowledge all the positive events that are connected with Luther's work and Luther's teaching. And second, of course, we have to be aware of the fact that Reformation is much more than Martin Luther, but when it comes to reception history of in the Protestant-Jewish dialogue, Martin Luther plays a central role. So I focus on Luther and his writings. Later, I will tell you why Luther is wearing this yellow blindfold. I will come to this in a few minutes. I want to take you on a journey about 1,000 years, but I only have 30 minutes, so it will be a very fast ride. So we have to focus on some stopovers, and a central part of our ride is the year 1523, when Martin Luther published his first so-called Judenschrift. So after a short overview of the history of Christian hostility against the Jews, I want to talk about his Judenschrift from 1523 and compared with his second one from 1543. Then we jump into the 20th century. We will talk about how the Nazis referred to Martin Luther, and after Shoah, after Holocaust, readjustment, changes in Protestant-Jewish relationship began, and then we talk about the present, the burdening legacy of the Reformation, and some short conclusion. So Luther's first Judenschrift from 1523 is a starting point to focus on the relationship of the churches of the Reformation to Judaism. When talking about interreligious dialogue, I will focus on Judaism. In my handout that will be published in the book, I also talk about the Protestant-Islamic relationship, but here I want to focus on Judaism. So first, the history of Christian hostility against the Jews. From the beginning, there was a separation of Christians from Judaism because with faith in Jesus Christ as the crucified and risen Son of God, Christianity could not exist within Judaism. The situation changed, however, when the small sect developed into the state church of the Roman Empire in the 4th century. Since then, Christianity has been in a superior position. Wilhelm Schwendemann expresses the situation in the Middle Ages as follows. You can read along. The fear of Jewish people and the practice of Jewish religion was a central motive of medieval hostility to Jews. The Jews, an American minority in society, were attributed magical powers because a basic understanding of Jewish religiosity was lacking and was also considered superfluous by the Christian majority. And yet the aversion towards the Jews could also be justified theologically. Thus, the idea had spread that Jews were endowed with an guilt for the death of Jesus. Schwendemann continues that the First Crusade in 1096, which triggered a mass murder of the Jewish population, was decisive for a change towards stronger hostility to the Jews. Although Jews and Christians coexisted peacefully during the Crusades, there was often no distinction between Muslims and Jews in the fight against the so-called non-believers. From the 12th century onwards, the idea that the Jews were to blame for the death of Jesus came to the fore. The Jews were identified with Judas, who had sold Jesus Christ for 30 pieces of silver. Judas personified and illustrated the betrayal of the Jews. Trondberg Eriksen, historian, he explains that although only a few church representatives were actively involved in the massacres, the propaganda called for the rejection of the Jewish religion and tirelessly pointed to the alleged historical and religious guilt of the Jews. The previously completely unknown charges suddenly appeared in several places at the same time, and another popular accusation was that the Jews were guilty of violating laws. Schwendemann writes, especially in the late Middle Ages, the persecution and destruction of entire communities was motivated by the report about alleged desecration of hosts. In addition, the refutation of the apparent disbelief of the Jewish population strengthened their own faith in the presence of Christ in the bread and wine and cemented their inherently fragile Christian identity vis-à-vis biblical Judaism. I think this is very interesting and also a link to the present time, because it is what we call religious othering today. And some of the professors from Brussels have been to Paderborn 2 weeks ago, and then we talked about religious othering, the phenomenon of our time, but it's the same like here in the Middle Ages, because religious othering means that group membership is defined by the exclusion of others. And as a result of a moral claim to exclusive representation, those whose membership is denied are disqualified and excluded. And we have the same here in the Middle Ages. So this accusation of the desecration of the host was closely connected with the characterization of the Jews as Christ killers, and was thus a direct recourse to the accusation of ritual murder. And the Jews despised the body of Christ, the host. This was the idea. And in some cases, there were even accusations that Jews practiced ritual murders of Christian children on Pesach. Eriksen sees the charge of the murder of Christian boys as a repetition of the New Testament event you all know, namely the murder of children in Bethlehem. And these accusations were new motives for anti-Jewish propaganda that began in 1146 around the Second Crusade. And one thing is very interesting, because Eriksen says the new quality is that Jews were accused not only of having committed such atrocities a long time ago, this is what everyone knew, but that they are still committing the same atrocities. They were not only to blame for something that had happened at the beginning of the reckoning, they were also attributed a being that had not changed since the murder of the innocent boys in Bethlehem and the murder of Christ in Jerusalem. So they have been bad and they are still bad. That's the idea. And you also know about the stereotype of money lending, the cliché of the Jewish lender, combined with the still valid prejudice of the special affinity of Jews to money, coming back to Judas and the 30 pieces of silver. And Jews who took up the profession of money lending in the absence of most alternatives were exposed to a disgraceful, usually so-called Judendsins. I think you know about this. One last stereotype of this time is the idea of world poisoning. In 1347, the plague, also called pestilence or Black Death, had afflicted large parts of Europe. You can see here at the map, starting from Turkey, Greece, southern Italy, and then spreading to other parts of Europe, northern Europe, Eastern Europe, 1349. And yeah, it was something unbelievable, and somehow the people didn't know they have never experienced something like this before. And it was 25 million victims, a disease Karl-Heinz Burmeister says we didn't know, for which we didn't know any help. And yeah, when there have been the first plague deaths in Spain and France, people started looking for culprits. And yeah, of course, they found culprits, the Jews. First attacks against Jews began. And yeah, why the Jews again? It was thought, Karl-Heinz Burmeister writes, to be possible to see that the Jews were far less likely to be infected by the plague than the Christians, though the Jews seem to be on their guard and to know exactly where the risk of infection lurked. And the simplest solution was to accuse them of having poisoned the wells. There was an obvious reason for this, however, for hygiene and medicine had much higher value among the Jews than among the Christians. And there were many doctors among Jews, so it was easy to find any poisons during house searches. The idea behind it was that the poison was from Jerusalem, and it was a very special poison because it was harmless to Jews, but deadly to Christians. And confessions were forced by torture, so by torture the Jewish people, said we poisoned the wells with our special poison from Jerusalem. It started in Switzerland, and we have seen it all over Europe. Here's a picture of how it worked, the torturing. So now we come to Martin Luther. Now we come to the year 1523. First a quote from 1543 from the second writing, because 200 years after the plague, Martin Luther responds to these accusations. We have a quote from 1543, and he says, "Such a desperate, raging, poison thing is about these Jews, as these 1,400 years have been and still our plague, pestilence, and all misfortunes. We've got real devils on them. That's all it is. There's no human heart against us. This is what they learn from the rabbits in the devil's nest of their schools." Martin Luther, 1543. Looking at the historical context of Luther and his anti-Jewish writings, Helena Albers, a historian from Paderborn, explains, by 1500, the Christian hatred of the Jews was greater than ever before, and the art of printing, it opened up many good possibilities, but it also enabled the rapid spread of anti-Jewish incitement, and so the Jews were once again expelled. There were attempts to expel them from the empire. In 1510, Jews had been burnt in Berlin for alleged desecration of hosts, so still the same allegations. In the course of the 15th century, almost all major cities and many of the largest territories expelled Jews. At the beginning of the 16th century, the anti-Jewish climate was particularly strong. So, Martin Luther lived in a time when it was a very strong anti-Jewish climate. I want to focus on two writings. The first one is 1523, that Jesus Christ was born a Jew. Schwendemann writes about this writing that it was new to the Reformation to treat Jewish people in a humane and friendly manner. However, this can be justified by the goals of the reformers. Schwendemann explains that they assume that the rediscovery of the liberating message of the Bible, the doctrine of justification and Christian freedom, Freiheit eines Christenmenschen, would become so attractive to the Jewish population that there would be an immense conversion of Jews to Protestantism. This was Luther's goal, and so he demanded to treat Jewish people humanly and kindly. And I think this excerpt from his 1523 writing makes Luther's intention quite clear. You can read along, "It is hard at first, let them suck milk first, and first recognize this man Jesus as the right Messiah. Then they should drink wine and learn that he is a true God. Therefore, my request and counsel would be that they be dealt with cleanly and that they be instructed from the scriptures, and that some of them may come here. But if you drive them only by force, so that they are immediately taken to the dogs, what good shall we do for them? If one wants To help them, one must not practice the law of the Pope, but of Christian love on them and accept them kindly. I leave it here this time until I see how I've worked. Andreas Bandels, theologian from Bonn, he speaks of a gentle variant of Christian mission to the Jews, but also emphasizes in the context of Luther's further theological development, his last sentence can also be understood as a threat, as a warning. However, it happened that the expected conversion of large parts of the Jewish population to Christianity did not take place, but Luther did not lose sight of this goal for a long time and therefore opened up something of a kind of social participation for the Jewish population. At first, he renounced the usual calumnies such as host desecration, ritual murder, or well poisoning, and even opposed them. But the Jewish religion, however, was the wrong choice for Luther from the very beginning. Helena Albers writes, Luther and with many Christian theologians in the 16th century, including Erasmus from Rotterdam, were convinced that Judaism was a false doctrine rendered superfluous by Christianity. After all, Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah from whom the stubborn Jews persistently refused to acknowledge. Jews who continued to refuse conversion became dangerous blasphemers for Luther, and due to the reception of the anti-Jewish writing Der ganze jüdische Glaub by Antonius Margarita, the final turnaround happened around 1530. The rumors about Jews who supposedly converted Christians finally brought about his reserve. So now we come to his, another writing from 1543 on the Jews and their lies. And the central excerpt are 7 instructions of the authorities on how to deal with the damned people of the Jews. And his first instruction is to set fire to their synagogues or schools. This is to be done in honor of our Lord and of Christendom, so that God might see that we are Christians. Second, he advises to destroy their houses, take away their prayer books and Talmudic writings. Fourth, the rabbis should be forbidden to teach. Fifth, safe conduct on the highways be abolished completely for the Jews. Sixth, usually prohibited to them. And seventh, they should do strong work. Let them earn their bread in the sweat of their brown cells. So we clearly have a transition from Luther's early to his late writings about the Jews, and this is, I think, very good illustrated in the book Basic Knowledge of Judaism by Nachama, Honorka, and Domhoff. They say Luther's attitude, however, changed radically when he realized that the new Lutheran form of Christian preaching did not in any way lead the Jews to convert to Christianity. Important, this conversion, however, would have been a welcome proof of the correctness of Lutheran theology in comparison with the traditional Roman doctrine. Luther could have said, okay, you were not able to do something in 1,500 years, and I was able to do this, but it didn't work. So in 1543, out of anger at the alleged evil will of the Jews, the reformer formulated in his pamphlet on the Jews and their lies that the fundamental error of the Jews was their belief that their election already justified them before God. And I think you know this writing, and you have seen his instructions to the authorities just some minutes ago. And I think you come to a conclusion like Helena Albers when she says there are many anti-Jewish stereotypes that can be found here, that those recommendations to the authorities are drastic measures of repression which amounted to total religious and social impoverishment of the Jewish minority. She says he wanted to forbid them to practice their religion and profession, to abolish their free passage, instead expropriate them and force them to hard labor. And the next step is to see how the Nazis referred to Martin Luther. I want to stick with the first advice, the first instruction, first to set fire to the synagogues or schools, and this should be done in honor of our Lord, so God might see that we are Christians. set fire to the synagogues or schools. Almost 100 years later, this happens in Germany. Synagogues burn in Germany, and the Reichspogromnacht marked a temporary climax in the state-controlled discrimination and violence of the Nazis against the Jewish population, leading to their open persecution, and which later led to the Shoah, the Holocaust. And the Protestant bishop of Thuringen, Martin Sasse, from German Christians, Deutsche Christen, he declared this is a birthday gift to Martin Luther. On November 10, 1938, Luther's birthday, synagogues born in Germany. At this hour, we must hear the voice of the man who, as the German prophet in the 16th century, began as a friend of the Jews. He's writing from 1523, who, driven by his conscience, driven by experience and reality, became the greatest anti-Semite of his time, the one of his people against the Jews. End of the quote by Martin Sasse. Yeah, the Nazis always tried to legitimize their many things theologically with references to Luther. The so-called Endulus Institute, the Judaization Institute, was founded that tried to eliminate the Jewish influence on German church life, erase them from the Bible and from the songbooks and everything. We have always connections, Luther wrote, and the swastika. We have many writings about Luther, and here once again you can read not just post-Semitic from 1523, but rather as powerful indictments, his prophetic condemnation of the Jews out of Christian religious responsibility, this ardent love for the German folk and his legacy to us. Or Siegfried Leffler, founder of the so-called Endulus Institute. It's only German, but you see two names, Luther and Hitler. They tried to put together somehow. It means if Luther was living today, his job would be Adolf Hitler's job. He would simply be Adolf Hitler. If Hitler lived 200 years ago, he would have been the reformer, and his name would have been Luther. So one thing is important. My colleague Stefan Wiederke and I, we have written, there's no direct line that can be drawn from the anti-Judaism of the Middle Ages to the racial anti-Semitism of National Socialism. But Luther's hatred of Jews proved to be connectable for modern anti-Semitism. In the writings of the reformer, the National Socialists also found the supposed instructions for action for the Reichspogromnacht. And it must therefore be clearly emphasized that this is an appropriation and misuse of Luther, despite all the connecting factors. But to absolve Luther entirely of anti-Semitism is also problematic in view of the drastic consequences of his demands for the life and land of Jews. So Andreas Pankwitz says, the clear distinction between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism is somehow an artificial separation. He says, as if it made a difference for the persecuted of which motives the perpetrators act. And for him, it is very important that Luther called for the eliminatory act. And therefore, he prefers to speak of anti-Semitism, also in Luther's case, but it is a different variety of anti-Semitism than especially the Nazi anti-Semitism. And current research on anti-Semitism also lists anti-Judaism as the first manifestation of anti-Semitism. So this confirms the assumption that the clear distinction is an artificial separation. So we have the Holocaust, we have the Shoah, and this represents a turning point, but it took many decades before the relationship to Judaism was actually readjusted in Evangelische Kirche in Deutschland, the Protestant Church in Germany. I don't have that much time anymore, so I skip the first document. It's the State Synod of Evangelische Kirche in Rhineland. It was the first to address the historical necessity of establishing a new relationship between the church and the Jewish people. This is very important, but it's only the declaration of a single national church. Yeah, but maybe I'll show you this one is very important. at the end, they say we deny that the people of Israel have been rejected by God or have been overtaken by the church, but this was the idea for hundreds of years, also in the Protestant church, also in the large parts of the 20th century. So this was an important step, but as I said, only declaration of the single national church. Therefore, 20 years later, the memorandum Christian and Jews 3, Christen und Juden 3, was groundbreaking, and it came to an important conclusion. It says, first, as Christians, we recognize the wrong way of our previous thinking and acting toward the Jews in view of the Shoah. Second, we face the consequences of such misconduct and realize that the Shoah means a deep turning point in the relationship between Christians and Jews. And third, we allow ourselves to be on a new path of judgment and action. And here follows what is probably the most important sentence of the entire document of hundreds of pages. Israel remains God's chosen people, although it has not accepted the belief in Jesus as its Messiah. It's the burdening legacy of the Reformation. Yeah, now I come back to the picture from the beginning. The statue of Martin Luther in Wittenberg wore a yellow blindfold on November 9th, 2015, anniversary of the Reichsbewohner, Monday before Luther's birthday. It was Friedrich Kramer, today the provincial bishop of the Evangelische Kirche in Mitteldeutschland, who had created it for him as a protest against Luther's hatred of the Jews. And there's a historical connection. In the Middle Ages, many representations of the synagogue as the personification of Judaism were blindfolded because the idea was that the Jews were blind to the message of the gospel. 2 days later, there was the synod of the EKD that distanced itself from the anti-Jewish statements of the Reformation by publishing Martin Luther and the Jews, a necessary reminder on the occasion of the Reformation anniversary. This document summarizes historical insights of the EKD. For example, they said the Reformation aimed to reform the church by the power of the gospel. This rarely gave rise to a new way of regarding the Jews. The reformers operated within a tradition of anti-Judaic thought patterns, the root of which reached back to the church. So it is our responsibility to clarify how we deal with the anti-Judaic statements made during the Reformation period and the history of their impact and reception. We ask to what extent they fostered a generally anti-Judaic attitude in Protestant churches and how this can be overcome today. Engaging with Luther's attitude towards the Jews takes an exemplary significance in this process. We recognize the part played by the Reformation tradition and the painful history of mismeeting between Christians and Jews. The far-reaching failure of Protestant churches in Germany with regard to the Jewish people fills us with sorrow and shame. The horror at such historical and theological aberrations and the awareness of our share of guilt and the continued suffering of Jews give rise to a special responsibility to resist and oppose all forms of hostility and inhumanity towards Jews today. So now I come to the conclusion. So it's my last slide. I wanted to show you that anti-Semitism is diverse and has a long history that stretches back to the beginning of Christianity and the importance in the Middle Ages. The Reformation period, especially the year 1523, played a central role. However, the claim that Luther, as he expressed himself in the scripture, that Jesus Christ was born a Jew, is still to be understood as a friend of the Jews, cannot be sustained. On the contrary, the teaching of the Reformation also had its share in it with the talk of freedom of the Christian, which proclaimed God's justification only through his beloved Son, Jesus Christ, and at the same time meant a rejection of works that were clearly Jewish in character. Luther initially spoke positively about Jewish people, but only because he wanted to convert them into Christianity. The Jewish religion was the wrong choice for Luther from the very beginning. When the conversion failed, he formulated open hatred of the Jews in his writing on the Jews and their lives. The Nazis also appropriated Luther and his writings and were able to fall back on existing anti-Semitic ideas. EKD writes, it is not possible to draw simple continuous lines. Nevertheless, in the 19th and 20th century, Luther was a source for theological and ecclesial anti-Judaism as well as for political anti-Semitism. And until today, the issue of Martin Luther and anti-Semitism is a burden on the EKD, which has taken a clear position in the face of the continuing problem of anti-Semitism. And maybe let me allow one last thought. Luther believed that the destruction of Jewish synagogues was something to be done in honor of our Lord and of Christendom, so that God might see that we are Christians. And his idea was, a quote from Luther, because they curse us, they curse our Lord also. If they curse our Lord, they curse God the Father, creator of heaven and earth. And so Luther actually was convinced that it would please God if harm were done to his chosen people. The belief that the Jews had lost their destiny and that the election had passed over entirely to Christianity influenced the teachings of the Reformation and persisted in the following centuries. Today, the Protestant church knows better. The attacks against the Jews were also attacks against God, and the Christians did not take the place of Judaism, but instead took the side of Judaism. Thank you very much.
I was asked to draw some lessons from 500 years of Reformation. What did the Reformation bring to Western culture? And at the same time, I was asked to look at the future. Where do we go from here? I want to tackle this twofold question by using one method. I call it a hermeneutic dialectic. This means that I am aware that if I discover something good in the past, a bad thing can emerge from it, and vice versa. How something good got corrupted, and how a bad thing got a good outcome. That shows me a cultural dynamic. It happens all the time in history. That will make me able to visualize the future. If you know the past, you can feel the future. Now, at the same time, I will put the Reformation into a bigger picture of cultural evolution in Western Europe. Some say that the Reformation was the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of modernity. Now, maybe this is true in a certain way for a figure like Martin Luther, who stood with one leg on both sides. But when you take a closer look, and you look at the early Renaissance thinkers who preceded the reformers, also look at the 100 years of confessional wars in Europe during the Reformation, we can easily conclude with Friedrich Nietzsche that the Reformation expanded the Middle Ages. That Luther opposed modernity and progress by choosing sides with dukes and landlords against the peasants in Germany, as Karl Marx wrote. The bigger picture must make us aware that there is no one-size-fits-all in cultural and religious studies. Now, I want to discuss with you the heritage and the future of the Reformation traditions in 3 topics. First one will be freedom, second, history, and the third one, the serenity, some say the death of God. 3 topics, 3 words. I don't have a PowerPoint. Well, use your imagination, I imagine. First topic, freedom. Now, without any doubt, we can say that the Reformation era injected Western culture with a strong longing for freedom. I follow partly the suggestions of Brad Gregory in his Unintended Reformation. It was already discussed this morning. I follow him partly where he states that the religious upheavals during the Reformation resulted in a secular society. I said, I follow him partly because, in my view, Gregory overlooks the specific notion of freedom that reformers introduced and which was sharply defined by Martin Luther in his famous opening lines of his pamphlet on the freedom of a Christian. I quote, "The Christian is a perfectly free lord of all, subject to none. The Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all." Two sides. It was not Luther, nor the reformers, but the radical Enlightenment that disconnected the initial connectedness of the notion of freedom. According to Martin Luther and others, man is only free when he connects himself with God and the neighbor. Then man is free in connectedness. The disconnected freedom has also a downside. It is on this side Luther was standing with one leg in the Middle Ages, especially on the image of man formulated by Augustine. Following his great example, Luther invoked original sin and compared man to a larva locked in his cocoon. Man is, according to Luther, incurvatus in se, naturally turned inwards, locked in himself. But Luther learned from the Florentine Renaissance thinker Pico della Mirandola that humans can transcend themselves, can transcend their limitations. But for Pico, this was a natural capacity. Luther pointed at grace, the gift of God. The downside of freedom in Lutheran perspective is what later is called predestination. God will choose. You can't do it yourself. Pico, Renaissance, underscored our natural capacity to upgrade our existence to a life close, like he said, close to the angelic being. Or we can also downgrade ourselves and live like animals. It is our free will to do so. Luther opposed that free will. He opposed Erasmus, Christian humanism. We heard it this morning, this afternoon. Erasmus, who borrowed Pico's program of free will to establish Christian humanism in European culture. Luther stuck to grace alone. He marked his concept of freedom in an apocalyptic worldview. The result today is an evangelical black and white thinking that opposes the world and progress. So now that we have seen both sides of the notion of freedom that generated during Reformation, we can look at the future. I propose to re-establish the notion of freedom in connectedness. But connecting this with free will, sort of Christian humanism, not based on faith alone, but combined with natural reason. In the future, we will have to connect with nature and the planet, just as we have to connect ourselves with our neighbors again, especially those who are in need. And this with a view to freedom for all people in this world, not in the next. So that's what I learned from the Reformation and look with that lesson to the future, moving to the notion of freedom. Let us now look at the second topic I want to discuss with you, history, our view on history. Children of the Reformation made at the beginning of the 17th century a lucrative combination of faith and rational ethics, as we've heard from colleagues. The source of this Puritanism was the immediate contact of the individual with God. To make that possible. There's nothing between you and God. The quality of faith was the instrument or excellence of this unmediated relation with God. Now, the Reformation opened the doors of the closed monastic view, the closed monastic world, and allowed God to intervene in every facet of human life. Puritan ethics introduced a worldly asceticism that eventually, according to Max Weber in the Protestantische Ethiek, in its American form and articulated by Benjamin Franklin, let the spirit of capitalism out of the body. Franklin said, time is money, money is productive and fruitful. So it became common sense to work hard and to prosper. It was a gift of God to become wealthy. But this enhanced rationality also introduced methodically doubt and historical criticism. Biblical texts, the teaching of the church were tested by reason. This enabled Enlightenment philosophers, such as Kant and Hegel, to consider natural dynamics or the developments occurring within creation teleologically. God has made a world and deposit his will in it. God will also complete his creation. Just don't know how. That rationality made it possible for people like Isaac Newton to look for fixed laws, searching for the laws of God in nature. Kant described the limits of reason and thereby gave way to faith. Hegel referred to the dynamics of reality, of both man and history, as becoming. Kant and Hegel were raised in a Protestant, pietistic environment. In their work, we see the ripe fruit of the intertwining of faith and reason, namely the belief in progress. In this we see at the same time the legacy and future of the Reformation thinking. The fathers of the Reformation pointed at heaven and the possibility to connect with God individually. Their children and grandchildren used their common sense to live according to God's will that was established in nature. This shows a firm goal in history. Everything becomes. Everything wants to be there. Life in general has a goal, namely becoming reality, overcoming material limitations and downfalls through spirituality, through the power of the Spirit. We call that today empowerment. So, the legacy of the Reformation and Puritan spirituality clarifies the destiny of existence by pointing to its spiritual content. Because we are in the 21st century struggling with burnouts, depressions, with senselessness, nihilism on the one hand, and religious radicalism, that is the longing for a glorious afterlife. On the other hand, by the way, nihilism and radicalism are strictly speaking the same. We should, in the future, I think, develop methods to empower people, that is, to strengthen their individual conscience by working together for a better world. In the 17th century, associations arose in the Reformation context that worked out such a method to empower the individual with view on making the world a better place. Associations such as the Brothers of the Rosicrucian Order or the Fraternity of Freemasons. The legacy of the Reformation is the belief and progress that we must sustain in the future by working out methods to empower people. That's, in my view, what comes out of the Reformation era and the Counter-Reformation, of course, in view of the future. Regarding to history, of course. And now the third topic, the serenity of God. Now, we will move now on the theological scene. Why was God silent when two young boys in 1523 burned at the stake in Brussels? Why was God silent? For Luther, it was clear. Luther wrote a song for that occasion. The text is on the website of Dick Rusten. He wrote a song and he gave the message in that song that God triumphed in the life and death of those two boys. It's a triumph. Today we know that when violence and death becomes a triumph of God, we must be aware. The Reformation ended in that way the day she started. Because at that time, a period of more than 100 years of war and bloodshed began. So the possibility to connect unmediated with God gave birth to an uncountable number of churches. Like the famous saying, put two Protestants together, you have three churches. There are always brothers and sisters who are straighter in doctrine than the others, who have a better faith than the others, and who are consequently separating themselves from others who become too lukewarm or too liberal. According to the Association of Religion Data Archives, there are about 200 official Protestant denominations for the US alone, which on a global scale runs into the thousands. Add to this a growing number of house churches, bringing the number of independent Protestant churches to around 35,000, according to the Association of Religion Data Archives. 35,000. We may wonder if this was God's intention when he gave orders to Luther and his companions to start the Reformation. Just as we may wonder about God's will when we look at the Catholic Inquisition. Now, these facts and figures must make us cautious and serene when we want to talk about God. Theologically, we can say that God himself also treads earthly reality very serenely. He does not interfere in denominational discussions, and anyone who thinks somewhat thoroughly and more deeply about traditional faith soon finds out that these discussions remove man from the essence of the word. The lessons of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation teaches that confessions are side issues and can consequently be ignored if one has not yet got to the heart of the matter. The heart of the matter, the core of Christian methods is salvation. Salvation through compassion and forgiveness. The plea for increased serenity when it comes to talking about God is even louder in extremely secular times, because we are witnessing a growing tension between religions and between secular worldviews. Freedoms that have become a fundamental part of religious identity are now under threat. For example, circumcision or slaughter without stunning, headscarves. Intolerance is once again, rising very strong. What can we do about it? How can we bridge that gap in worldviews? Now, the Augustinian line that Luther drew in his theology speaks of two worlds, two cities. The religious city of God and the secular city of man. The first one, the city of God, is growing into the second one and will eventually, at the end of time, take over. Luther thought he lived very close to the end of time. Two cities, don't lose the gap. This means a politic of patience. We have to wait. We have to wait. God will eventually take over. The second framework stipulates a universal religion based on morality. Universal religion based on morality, as we know it from Cusanus in the Renaissance, comes during the Enlightenment, or today in modernity, Hans Kuhn. Universal religion based on morality. This means that we have to oblige, or duty, it's our duty to perform that religion. This means a politics of obligation, which eventually will collide and collides with the reality of the plural worldviews we live. Third framework to overcome that gap in worldviews. Third framework is based on tolerance. Thomas Aquinas, John Locke. Obliging tolerance by law creates the problem. This is what we more or less do today. That creates the problem of discrimination. So we need a fourth way in the future. We need a fourth way. So what can we learn from the Reformation period and from the broader spectrum, cultural spectrum? We can learn three important lessons for today. That's very important that we take notice of those 3 points. The first one, a plurality of worldviews and concepts of God is a fact. It was so 500 years ago, it is 300 years ago, it's today, and it will always be. There will always be a plurality of worldviews and concepts of God. Second, instead of combating that plurality with religious wars, we can see that multitude of worldviews and concept of God as a richness, as a wealth. 3, we have to realize that people with a strong conviction, with a strong belief, must be able, if they deepen their belief, to create an overarching communality, as I call it. An overarching communality, that means that it is valid in all religious and secular contexts, based on the respect of human dignity. If you really have a strong conviction and belief, and you deepen that belief, eventually we must trust that we all come to the same ground. We are equal. We are equal bone standing before God. I call that human dignity and overarching communality. So we can sum up these three lessons or observations in one attitude that is driven what we call embracing plurality, not fighting it, embracing it. Embracing plurality, the overarching communality, is indeed the philosophical groundwork of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights issued in 1948. That is after the disaster of Auschwitz. But why was God silent during World War II? God was silent because he has faith in man. He knows that humankind will show resilience and will stand up again after the disaster that humans themselves created. God trusts man for his resilience and progress. The trust, this trust, God's trust in man, is the basis of his God's serenity. It is therefore necessary, I think, that Christianity at large, and churches in particular, work together on theology of resilience as an answer to God's serenity. I think that is the challenge for theology in the future. One important element of this theology I can mention, because time is short. One important element of this theology is the nuance of the importance of creeds. Different creeds are like walls that divide humans in a good and in a bad camp. Creeds must be nuanced. Creeds are the product of religious populism. So we must learn our lessons and know that plurality precedes unity and not the other way around. Plural humanity must be able to have a perception of God as the one that unites. It is God and his serenity that gives us resilience to overcome the growing nihilism in the world. So that, my friends, colleagues, that were three bullets, three topics that I wanted to discuss with you this afternoon. But I want to stress also that the debate on the meaning of the Reformation is far from over. Considerations of the religious upheavals in the 16th century are not served by unsubtle framing. Certain elements have proved very valuable, other less fruitful or even destructive. The examples, the notion of freedom, interconnectedness is very valuable if we succeed to trust the natural evolution and the initial goals of creation. Then the notion of freedom, of reformation, is very valuable. We must nuance the apocalyptic high voltage of the Reformation and establish the same faith, but in the dynamics of progress. And last but not least, we must answer God's serenity in the theology of resilience, and that by embracing plurality and proclaim before our historical creeds the contemporary necessity of human rights and dignity. By doing this, we will know where to go from here. Thank you for your attention.